You've been there, haven't you? That moment when your child looks you straight in the eye and does exactly the opposite of what you just told them to do. The flash of anger, the immediate thought that they're being defiant, disrespectful, maybe even manipulative. And then comes the flood of self-doubt that keeps you awake at 3 in the morning, wondering if you're failing as a parent, if your child is destined for a life of rebellion and chaos. What if those moments that make you want to tear your hair out are actually windows into your child's developing genius? Jean Piaget spent over 60 years observing children, documenting their behaviors, and uncovering the hidden patterns that reveal how the human mind develops from birth to adolescence. His research revealed that what adults interpret as defiance is often the child's mind performing sophisticated cognitive operations that most adults couldn't execute if they tried. These aren't random acts of rebellion or attention-seeking behaviors. They're precise indicators that your child's brain is reaching new developmental milestones, creating neural pathways that will serve them for the rest of their lives. By the time we're finished, you'll never look at your child's challenging behaviors the same way again. In the spring of 1920, in a modest laboratory at the Jean-Jacques Rousseau Institute in Geneva, Piaget was conducting what would become one of his most revealing experiments. The task appeared straightforward. Arrange the blocks from smallest to largest. Then something extraordinary happened. According to traditional thinking, Marie-Claire should have immediately inserted this new block into its proper position. She completely dismantled her perfectly arranged sequence and began rebuilding it from scratch, placing the new block in different positions, testing various configurations, seemingly ignoring everything she had just learned. Her teacher, observing from the corner, was about to intervene, convinced that Marie-Claire was being deliberately difficult or had somehow forgotten the simple task. Marie-Claire wasn't being disobedient or forgetful. Her mind was performing what Piaget would later term equilibration, the sophisticated cognitive process by which children restructure their understanding when new information challenges their existing mental frameworks. It demanded a complete reconceptualization of the relationship between size, sequence, and spatial organization. This is the first act of disobedience that reveals genius. When children refuse to accept simple solutions to complex problems, even when those solutions appear to work. Consider how this manifests in your daily life with children. You show them how to tie their shoes using the standard loop and pull method. They watch carefully, nod their understanding, and then proceed to invent their own elaborate system involving multiple knots and creative finger movements that takes 3 times as long and looks nothing like what you demonstrated. What if they're unconsciously responding to the fact that their fine motor skills, hand size, or cognitive processing style requires a different approach? Children who refuse to accept that water poured from a tall, thin glass into a short, wide container remained the same amount, even after being shown multiple times. Children who insisted that the moon followed them personally as they walked, despite being told repeatedly that this was impossible. These children's minds were grappling with concepts that adults had oversimplified, and their disobedience was a sign that they were reaching for deeper, more complete understanding. The second act of disobedience that signals genius became clear to Piaget during his observations of children engaged in pretend play. Instead, he continued an elaborate game involving toy soldiers, blocks, and pieces of string. To any observer, Henri appeared to be blatantly ignoring his mother's instructions, choosing play over responsibility. His mother's frustration was escalating with each repeated request, and she was beginning to consider consequences and punishments. The string was being used to demonstrate strategic movements and supply lines. Henri's mind was performing multiple sophisticated cognitive operations simultaneously. He was integrating emotional information about his grandfather's experiences with factual information about historical events. When a child becomes so absorbed in learning that they seem to ignore external demands, they're demonstrating what Piaget called cognitive egocentrism, not in the negative sense of selfishness, but in the positive sense of complete intellectual absorption. You've probably witnessed this in your own children. But research shows that children in states of deep cognitive absorption literally cannot process external information in the same way adults do. The tragedy is that most adults, not understanding the cognitive significance of these moments, interrupt them with increasingly forceful demands for compliance. We pull children out of their genius states to make them conform to arbitrary schedules and social expectations. We train them to abandon deep learning in favor of immediate responsiveness to authority. Maybe they were building something complex out of random materials they found around the house. Your first instinct was probably to redirect them towards something more productive or appropriate. But what if I told you that these moments of apparent defiance are actually when children's minds are at their most brilliant? If you've ever felt guilty about interrupting these moments, or if you've ever wondered whether you should let them continue even when it's inconvenient, leave a comment with just these words. Your recognition might be exactly what another parent needs to read today to start supporting their child's natural learning process instead of fighting against it. You have more power to change how we think about childhood development than you realize. This became apparent during his famous conservation experiments, where children consistently rejected logical arguments in favor of their own perceptual observations. The water level rose higher than in the original glass. To adults, this appears to be clear evidence of illogical thinking, perhaps even willful stubbornness. Yet she refused to accept the adult's explanation, seemingly choosing her immediate perception over logical analysis. But Piaget recognized that Lucien's response revealed sophisticated cognitive processing. She was essentially saying that if logical reasoning produces conclusions that contradict sensory observation, then the logical reasoning must be incomplete or flawed. From an adult perspective, this seems backwards. But Piaget understood that children who refuse to abandon their sensory evidence in favor of adult logic are demonstrating cognitive integrity and empirical thinking that many adults lose as they become socialized into accepting authority-based reasoning. You explain to your child that sharing their toys will make them happy, but they observe that sharing actually makes them feel sad and frustrated. You tell them that bedtime is necessary for their health and growth, but their body tells them they're not tired, and their experience tells them that the most interesting things happen after they go to bed. So they resist, appearing defiant and unreasonable. They're insisting that claims about reality be supported by observable evidence, not just logical arguments or authority statements. The fourth, and perhaps most profound act of disobedience that reveals genius involves children's refusal to accept adult timelines for their own developmental processes. Piaget observed that children who seemed to deliberately resist age-appropriate expectations were often protecting their own optimal learning pace and style. His teachers and parents expected him to begin thinking abstractly about hypothetical situations, to understand complex cause and effect relationships, and to engage in sophisticated logical reasoning. Everyone around Philippe was pushing him to catch up with his age-appropriate developmental expectations, creating increasing pressure and frustration for everyone involved. The boy had somehow recognized that his mind wasn't ready for sustained abstract thinking and was consciously choosing to continue building the concrete operational foundations that would eventually support more advanced cognitive processes. This fourth type of disobedience involves children's refusal to be rushed through developmental stages before they've fully integrated the learning from their current stage. We now know that cognitive development is not linear or predictable, and that children who are allowed to progress at their own pace ultimately achieve higher levels of competence than those who are pushed to meet external timelines. Consider the pressure placed on children to read by certain ages, regardless of whether their visual processing, auditory discrimination, or phonemic awareness has developed sufficiently to support fluent reading. The same pattern appears in social development, where children are expected to demonstrate age-appropriate social skills regardless of their temperament, cultural background, or individual processing style. Throughout his decades of research, Piaget documented case after case of children whose apparent disobedience masked sophisticated cognitive processes. Jacques, who insisted on rebuilding puzzles using his own system instead of following the picture on the box, was developing superior spatial reasoning and creative problem-solving skills. Each of these children appeared to be difficult, stubborn, or non-compliant. His work revealed that the capacity for genius exists in every child, but it requires specific conditions to flourish. Children need permission to question adult explanations, time to work through complex cognitive processes without interruption, space to trust their own sensory and emotional experience, and freedom to develop at their own pace without external pressure. We're training them to accept oversimplified explanations, to abandon complex thinking when it becomes inconvenient for others, to distrust their own experience in favor of authority statements, and to rush through important developmental processes to meet external expectations. The tragedy is that most of us experience this suppression in our own childhoods. When we understand that childhood disobedience often masks cognitive sophistication, we can begin to respond differently. Instead of immediately correcting or redirecting, we can pause and ask ourselves what sophisticated cognitive process might be occurring. Instead of imposing our timelines and expectations, we can create space for children to work through their own learning processes. The child who refuses to accept your simplified explanation may be reaching for deeper understanding. The child who trusts their senses over your logic may be demonstrating scientific thinking. The child who resists age-appropriate challenges may be protecting their own optimal learning pace. It means understanding the difference between behaviors that require redirection and behaviors that require support. It means learning to distinguish between willful defiance and cognitive sophistication. It means developing the patience to allow children's natural learning processes to unfold, even when it's inconvenient or doesn't match our expectations. The behaviors that frustrated you become windows into sophisticated cognitive processes that you can support and nurture. The moments that triggered conflict become opportunities for deeper connection and understanding. The children who maintain access to these 4 types of disobedience throughout their development become the adults who change the world. They become the scientists who question established theories, the artists who create new forms of expression, the innovators who solve problems others can't see, and the leaders who trust their own experience over conventional wisdom. Most importantly, they become the adults who can recognize and support genius in the next generation of children, breaking the cycle of cognitive suppression that has been passed down through generations of well-meaning but misguided attempts to create obedient children. The children who appear most disobedient during their early years often become the most innovative and successful adults, provided their cognitive processes are recognized and supported rather than suppressed and redirected. But here's what makes this even more powerful. When you begin to recognize these 4 types of disobedience as genius in action, you don't just change how you respond to children. You begin to reconnect with the genius that still exists within you. You begin to reclaim the cognitive sophistication that was trained out of you during your own childhood. You start to trust your own thinking processes again, to honor your own pace of development, to question explanations that don't feel complete, and to resist pressure to simplify when complexity is called for. This is perhaps Piaget's greatest gift to us. It's natural and universal, existing in every child and persisting in every adult who has maintained connection to their own cognitive sophistication. They're signs that a child's mind is working exactly as it should, reaching for complexity, integration, authenticity, and optimal development. We stop seeing their challenging behaviors as evidence of defiance or difficulty, and start seeing them as evidence of the sophisticated cognitive processes that will serve them throughout their lives. And in doing so, we create a world where the next generation of children can maintain access to their natural cognitive gifts, where innovation and creativity are supported from the earliest ages, and where the complex thinking required to solve our world's most challenging problems is nurtured rather than suppressed. You know, I started this channel because I recognized how many of us are walking around carrying the wounds of having our childhood genius misunderstood. How many of us learned to suppress our natural cognitive sophistication, to simplify our thinking, to ignore our inner experience, and to meet others' expectations instead of honoring our own developmental needs. This understanding changes everything about how we see children, how we see ourselves, and how we can support the kind of thinking that our world desperately needs. I explore how understanding child development can heal our own developmental wounds, how recognizing genius in others helps us reclaim our own cognitive gifts, and how creating space for natural learning processes transforms every relationship in our lives. There's a subscribe button right here that will ensure you never miss these insights that could transform how you see yourself and the children in your life. Think of it as your first step in reclaiming the cognitive sophistication that's been yours all along. Next week, we're exploring another groundbreaking discovery from Piaget's research.